On the day a tech magnate was set to marry his dazzling personal assistant, a cryptic envelope arrived from his former wife. It wasn't a plea or a threat. It was a quiet revelation that dismantled everything he'd built from within. He thought he had replaced her. What he didn't know was that she held the keys to it all. Smooth jazz played low from the built-in ceiling speakers, blending with the soft clinking of ice in a tumbler of scotch. Nathan Calloway leaned back into his Scandinavian leather recliner in his penthouse office, one leg crossed, fingers tapping lightly on the armrest as he gazed through the vast floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Seattle skyline. The lights from the city shimmered against the calm surface of Elliott Bay, with sailboats gently swaying in place, completing the portrait he had spent decades perfecting. Wealth, stability, prestige, power. Tonight wasn't about numbers. The acquisition had closed. The tech partnership with the Japanese conglomerate had been finalized. His name was on every business headline. His company wasn't just successful, it was dominant. But Nathan wasn't toasting balance sheets this evening. He was getting ready for something more intimate, something that felt less like an ending and more like a rebrand. The door creaked softly as someone entered. Camilla Blake, his executive assistant, or as most in his inner circle suspected, more than that, stepped into the office with the smooth confidence of someone fluent in the currency of influence. Her blazer was draped over her arm, her silk blouse slightly unbuttoned, but every move was purposeful. Nothing about Camilla was ever unintentional, from the way she held herself to the deliberate pauses in her speech that drew people in. "Mr. Calloway," she said, placing a folder on his desk. "The courier just delivered these final documents from the divorce attorney. They just need your signature." He took the file, eyes briefly scanning the title before flipping it open. "Finally," he muttered, reaching for his pen. Camilla remained silent. She stood at the corner of the desk, watching him. Not his hand, not the documents, his face. There wasn't a single twitch, not a second of hesitation. Just clean, emotionless strokes of ink ending a 17-year marriage. "That's that," he said, snapping the folder closed. "It's official." Camilla nodded subtly, and for a beat, neither spoke. Then, with a tone more personal than professional, she asked, "How does it feel?" Nathan turned to her, offered a faint smile, and lifted his glass slightly. The room fell back into quiet, save for the jazz whispering from the speakers. Nathan glanced around, at the sleek furnishings, the modern art on the walls. The rows of untouched rare books meant more for display than reading. It was all curated, his aesthetic, his taste, his domain. But it hadn't always been this way. Once, it had been shared. Helena Calloway, now just a signature on a legal document, used to fill these rooms with purpose and plans. She had chosen the colors, curated the art, envisioned the rooftop lounge he now claimed as his sanctuary. Her touch was in the details, soft, quiet, unmistakable. But eventually, that warmth faded into silence, and silence hardened into disinterest. Nathan stood and moved to the window. His reflection stared back at him in the glass, overlapping the glow of the city and the man he had become. Polished, distant, feared. He took another sip of his scotch. "She didn't even fight," he said, mostly to himself. "Didn't challenge anything, just signed and vanished." Camilla tilted her head. "Maybe she was done to," he chuckled quietly. "Helena was never the type to disappear without leaving a mark." Camilla raised a brow but said nothing. She simply stepped closer and rested a gentle hand on his arm. "What matters is ahead now." Nathan looked from her hand to her face. The curl of her lips hinted at something long unsaid, something that had lingered in the space between them for months, maybe longer. He didn't move away. "You're right," he said gently. "It's time to move forward." On the other side of the city, in a modest two-bedroom walk-up tucked between rows of aging brownstones, Helena Calloway sat at a small kitchen table, scattered with old envelopes, faded bills, and a chipped ceramic mug she'd had for years. Her hair, still damp from the shower, clung to her cheeks, and a worn navy cardigan draped loosely over her shoulders. She stared at the envelope in front of her, thick, tan, and heavy with finality. The finalized divorce paperwork had arrived earlier that afternoon, but she hadn't touched it yet. She didn't need to. She already knew every word it contained. She had seen the drafts months ago. Nothing on paper could surprise her anymore. The real shocks were already behind her. The slow retreat in Nathan's voice, the The way his gaze no longer lingered on her. The long nights he stopped explaining. The last few years hadn't ended with a bang. They had faded, piece by piece. And yet, the envelope made her uneasy. It wasn't sadness, not even anger. It was a hollow stillness, like finishing a story you hadn't realized you were reading. She finally broke the seal, flipped through the pages, and signed her name. She noticed her handwriting, tighter, sharper, no longer soft around the edges. Did that mean something? The apartment was quiet, save for the soft dripping from the kitchen sink. On the worn-out couch, her 17-year-old son Mason was asleep, curled into himself, his backpack half open beside him. She stood, walked over, and gently pulled a throw blanket over him. His face, so much like Nathan's, was peaceful in sleep, untouched by the turmoil swirling around them. Helena returned to the kitchen and sat again. Her phone buzzed across the table. A message from her friend Dana. "How are you holding up?" Helena stared at the screen for a while before replying. "I'm okay, just tired." It was a lie, of course. But it was easier than trying to explain what that tiredness really felt like, not just physical. It lived in her bones, in her soul. Tired of pretending, tired of holding it together while everything she'd built was exchanged for someone younger, glossier, newer. She reached into the cupboard for a small wooden box. Inside, beneath some old photos and pressed petals, was a letter she had written long ago, unsent. She unfolded it slowly, reading it as if someone else had written those words, and something shifted in her expression. Slight, but present. A spark. A seed. A beginning not yet defined, but real. She folded the letter and looked out the small kitchen window. The city lights shimmered in the distance. Somewhere, Nathan Calloway was probably sipping his scotch and basking in victory. But Helena wasn't. Defeated. Not anymore. Something quiet and strong had started to take root beneath the ache. And before the night ended, she opened her laptop and began to type. A name, a thought, a first step. Whatever came next, she wouldn't be a footnote in Nathan Calloway's story. She'd write her own. What would you have done if you were Nathan after reading that letter? Share your thoughts in the comments. Was it justice or karma? Rate this story from 0 to 10. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that keep you locked in till the very end. The days after the divorce became a slow blur, like honey dripping through time. Helena Calloway started waking before sunrise, not out of routine or responsibility, but because her mind wouldn't let her sleep. The apartment was always cold at dawn, the old radiator creaking in protest as it struggled to catch up. She often sat at the edge of the bed, wrapped in a thick fleece robe, staring at the wall, unmoving, before finally gathering herself to rise. She didn't know what she was waiting for. A feeling. A breakthrough. A reset. All she had was silence and a stretch of unknown. The kitchen still carried the scent of last night's coffee. She reheated a cup in the microwave. It tasted bitter, lifeless, like even the flavor had given up. She stood at the narrow window, chipped mug in hand, looking out over the city. The streets were coming alive. Delivery vans groaning along the pavement, early risers darting to work, neon lights buzzing into clarity. The world kept spinning, but Helena stood still, suspended in the void between what once was and whatever was next. Outwardly, she looked put together. Neighbors offered her polite nods. The woman at the corner bodega asked after Mason. Her sister called each day, always with some sunny version of concern. "You just need a fresh start," she'd chirp, as if starting over was as easy as flicking a light switch. Helena thanked her and hung up, but inside she felt herself slowly unraveling, one fragile strand at a time. The legal packet still lay untouched on the coffee table. She had signed it already, but moving it felt impossible. It sat there like a wound left exposed. Every time she walked past, her gaze involuntarily flicked toward it, almost as if it might whisper something she had missed. But it didn't. It just waited, cold, final. Mason, her son, roamed the apartment with the jittery restlessness unique to 17-year-olds. Lately, he avoided her eyes, lived inside his headphones, spent hours locked in his room. Helena didn't press him. She knew he was processing things in his own way. Occasionally, he'd ask questions that cut right through her. "Do you think Dad's happier now? Or, was it because of me? Did I mess something up?" She always answered softly, firmly. "No, sweetheart. None of this is your fault." Still, she wondered if he believed her. Nathan, meanwhile, had already embraced his new life. Photos had begun popping up online, candid shots from elegant events, framed just right to show him smiling, drink in hand. Camilla beside him, her arm casually looped through his. The headlines were vague but sharp. Power couple rising, tech mogul seen with stunning assistant at industry gala. Helena never sought them out, but they still found her. Suggested articles, forwarded links. Gossip always knew where to land. She didn't scream, she didn't cry. What she felt was colder, a distant ache, not even painful anymore. Not because it didn't hurt, but because it had long stopped being a surprise. It was merely confirmation. She'd been written out of his narrative, deleted like a forgotten paragraph in a story he no longer cared to tell. But Helena hadn't forgotten. She remembered every piece. The nights she stayed up rewording his pitches. The meetings where she watched silently while he took the spotlight and the credit. The jobs she gave up. The years she poured into curating his image. The small concessions that accumulated until she no longer recognized her own voice. She remembered when Camilla first came on board, overdressed and underqualified. Nathan had shielded her from criticism. She's got potential, he had said. Now Helena finally understood what kind. One night, sleep evading her again, Helena pulled open a drawer and took out a worn, spiral-bound notebook she hadn't opened in years. Inside were old doodles, half-finished concepts, scribbled ideas for projects she once dreamed of bringing to life. She turned the pages slowly, taking in the pieces of herself she'd forgotten. There were outlines she once sketched for a boutique agency, concepts for a digital journal that never saw daylight. She stared at them like they belonged to someone else, someone she used to be, someone she had buried beneath years of compromise. The notebook trembled slightly in her hands, and for the first time in weeks her heart wasn't racing from grief. It was something else. A flicker. A question. What if I still could? It wasn't just ambition, it was something raw. A blend of guilt and grief. Grief not for the marriage, but for the version of herself she had slowly let disappear. That was the hardest part. Not the ending of a relationship, but the realization that she'd spent years learning how to be small, how to dim herself without even noticing. It wasn't ambition in the traditional sense. It wasn't even clarity yet. It was memory. The visceral sensation of once believing in something before the weight of someone else's dreams eclipsed her own. As she turned each page, she could hear echoes of a voice she hadn't listened to in years. Her own. Small, unsure, but insistent. She closed the notebook, laid it gently on the table, then walked into the living room. She looked at the divorce packet for a long moment. Then calmly, she moved it aside and placed the notebook at the center. Something changed in her eyes. Not rebellion, not yet, but purpose. A fragile thread of conviction she hadn't touched in years. The next morning, Helena dialed the number of her former mentor, a woman named Simone, someone who, years ago, had offered Helena a chance to go into business together. Helena had declined back then to support Nathan's dreams. The phone rang twice before Simone picked up, her voice warm and as straightforward as Helena remembered. "Helena," she said, surprised. "It's been a while." "I know," Helena replied softly. "But I was wondering, do you still have that spot downtown? The one you mentioned turning into a co-working space." Simone paused for a moment. "I do. It's just sitting empty, actually." "What if?" Helena hesitated. Then her voice grew stronger. "I think I might be ready to build something of my own." Simone didn't answer at first, then laughed quietly. "I always told you, you had more in you than people ever saw. Come by tomorrow, let's catch up." After the call ended, Helena sat quietly, letting the weight of that decision settle around her like light through dust. She didn't know exactly what this meant, or even what she wanted to create. But for the first time in years, she wasn't waiting for change to happen to her. She was walking toward something, undefined, unclear, but fully her own. And yet, beneath the quiet momentum, there was fear. Small, sharp, whispering that maybe she was too late, that maybe the world had already moved on. But she let that fear exist without giving it control. It would not get the final word. And for that moment, it was enough. The courage wasn't loud. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it pulsed inside her like a new rhythm she hadn't danced to in years. That afternoon, a package arrived from the legal office, an official copy of the divorce decree, notarized and sealed. She opened it, glanced at the signatures, then placed it in a folder and tucked it deep inside a cabinet. She didn't need to look at it again. It wasn't her story anymore. That evening after dinner, Mason sat beside her on the couch, eyes glued to his phone. "Mom," he asked suddenly, "are we going to be okay?" Helena looked at him for a long time before answering. "We already are." He didn't say anything after that, but he gave a small nod and rested his head on her shoulder. She kissed the top of his head and wrapped an arm around him. And for the first time since the divorce papers had arrived, Helena believed what she had just said. Meanwhile, up in the penthouse, Nathan poured himself a glass of wine. Camilla sat across from him, legs tucked beneath her. They were talking in low tones about the upcoming gala, what sponsors to prioritize, which press contacts to invite. He looked relaxed, as though this chapter suited him. But beneath the charm and curated confidence there were signs. Small fractures that only someone paying close attention might catch. But he hadn't noticed the cracks. The way Camilla's gaze lingered on his private documents. The subtle shifts in how she steered meetings. He hadn't seen how some of his most trusted allies were quietly backing away, uncertain about this new direction, wary of the rapid shifts in his personal world. He was too wrapped up in the illusion of success to sense the ground shifting beneath him. And under Helena's pillow there was a letter she had written the night she left the penthouse. Not for him, but about him. About the things no one else knew. About the truths buried under the empire he believed was untouchable. She hadn't yet decided whether she'd send it, but something told her she wouldn't have to. The expansive dining room in Nathan Calloway's penthouse shimmered under the amber light of a handcrafted chandelier, its crystal accents casting flickers of brilliance with every subtle movement in the space. The long granite table, once reserved for cozy family dinners, had become a venue for high-end client luncheons, wine tastings, and meticulously curated social evenings. Gone were the echoes of Mason's teenage laughter or Helena's soft, engaging voice musing about gallery openings or weekend road trips. Those memories had faded like old wallpaper. In their place was a different rhythm. Polished conversations, strategic toasts, and the careful laughter of guests whose presence came with strings attached. At the center of this evolution was Camilla Blake. No longer just the assistant beside Nathan, she had become the face of his reimagined lifestyle. She adjusted to her new environment swiftly. Within weeks of Helena's exit, Camilla had swapped out the earth-toned cushions for plush velvet ones, removed framed family moments, and replaced them with sharp modern artwork, and filled the penthouse with the scent of high-end candles that hinted of leather and spiced wood. Nathan hadn't objected. In fact, he had welcomed the changes. To him, they were progress, a stark break from the familiarity he had come to associate with stagnation. He told himself he didn't miss Helena. She had been foundational, yes, but foundational didn't mean eternal. In his mind, she was steady, dependable, but also too rooted. And to Nathan, rootedness looked a lot like limitation. Camilla was different. She challenged his instincts, brought a level of intensity wrapped in polish that made him feel newly awakened. She wasn't just a part of his circle. She'd carved out her own place in it. And Nathan admired people who created value. But not everything transitioned as smoothly as he expected. There were tensions, small, almost imperceptible, but real. Some of his longtime collaborators seemed less enthusiastic. One, during a private dinner, leaned in and remarked, "Helena had a way of grounding the room. It felt balanced when she was there." Nathan had nodded, smiled, steered the conversation elsewhere. But the comment lingered. Another partner backed out of a deal without any reason given. Nathan blamed it on market unpredictability, but a part of him sensed the shift, subtle, hard to articulate. Helena had provided a certain grace, a quiet elegance that stabilized their image. Camilla, while capable, brought a different tone, sharper, more pointed. Meanwhile, Helena was forging a new path, though without any grandeur. The downtown studio Simone had offered was dusty, cluttered. The traces of its previous tenants lingered. Curled-up posters, a cracked bar stool, an old espresso machine that hissed more than it brewed. But the light, the tall, unfiltered windows let sunshine spill onto the raw concrete floors. For Helena, it was untouched ground, rough, honest, and brimming with potential. She visited every afternoon after finishing her remote admin job for a neighborhood marketing startup. Just something to keep the lights on for now. Each day she brought supplies, notebooks, sketches, ideas. She painted one wall a deep moss green, set up a shelf packed with design books and business guides, and added a vintage leather settee she snagged at a thrift shop. She didn't have a clear plan yet. It might become a consulting firm, a collective space for creators, a tiny showroom. All she knew was it would be hers. Not a response to Nathan's empire, but a return to herself, long buried beneath the demands of propping someone else up. Mason often stopped by after school, sometimes just to work on assignments, sometimes to lend a hand. He didn't speak much, but his presence was an anchor, a quiet reassurance that she wasn't doing it alone. They were rebuilding something together, quietly, without ceremony. One evening, while they were organizing books on a shelf, Mason looked up and asked, "Why are you doing all this, Mom?" Helena paused, fingers resting on a hardback spine, and replied, "Because I need to remember what I'm capable of." He didn't ask anything more, just nodded and kept helping. The way he accepted her answer without question made something in her chest tighten, not with pain, but with quiet pride. She saw in him not just the child who had witnessed her unraveling, but the young man learning to trust her strength again. And that trust felt heavier than any courtroom document. It was earned in silence, in ordinary moments. Back at the penthouse, Camilla had begun taking over roles Helena once filled. She handled Nathan's calls during meetings, managed travel plans, negotiated vendor agreements, and started making executive choices without checking in first. At first, Nathan admired her initiative. But soon, the cracks appeared. She snapped at staff. She brushed off concerns from his leadership team. One senior director resigned without warning, citing a toxic environment. Nathan dismissed it as poor resilience. He'd always believed real performance came from pressure. But the strain was showing elsewhere, too. Camilla had asked to have certain investment accounts transferred under her name, saying it would streamline operational oversight. He agreed without pause. He trusted her. Or rather, he trusted the version of her he decided she was. Trust, by then, had become a routine gesture rather than an earned emotion. He'd done the same with Helena for years, and it never backfired, until now. But this time there was a difference. He had stopped listening. Not just to others, but to himself. He didn't question choices anymore. He endorsed them, signed off, moved on, until the consequences arrived, wrapped in silence and slow erosion. But he didn't recognize the irony. Or maybe he didn't want to. What he did begin to notice was the widening gap between them. Despite spending more time together, their conversations became transactional. More about deadlines than dreams. Camilla no longer laughed at his sarcasm like she used to. He noticed her texting late into the night, silencing her phone when he walked into the room. When he asked about it, she brushed him off. "Clients," she said. "It's just business." But even Nathan, proud as he was, couldn't ignore the subtle shifts. He started asking himself questions he hadn't needed to ask before, not because he distrusted her, but because he feared being outplayed. One morning, as he reviewed materials for a board presentation, he reached for a folder and noticed inconsistencies in the figures. The numbers didn't match his notes. He called Camilla in. "I updated them last night," she said smoothly. "Your data was out of date." He stared at her, unsure if he should feel impressed or undermined. "I didn't realize you were making those decisions now," he said evenly. She leaned against the desk, smiling. "I thought this was a partnership, or am I wrong?" Nathan didn't answer. She left moments later, but her words lingered in the silence. It wasn't the statement that rattled him, it was how confidently she'd said it. As if the line between collaboration and control had already blurred, and he hadn't even noticed. Elsewhere, across the city, Helena sat in her studio, sketching out a rough blueprint. An idea for a workshop series focused on career renewal for women over 40. It wasn't concrete yet, just pencil marks on paper. But it felt right. It felt like something she herself would have needed, back when she first began to feel unseen. Each line she drew wasn't just planning, it was remembering. Reclaiming a language she once spoke fluently before she was taught to quiet her voice. She picked up her phone and called Simone. "I want to hold a launch event," she said. "Nothing huge, just to test the idea." Simone didn't miss a beat. "I'll help you plan it. This is good." As Helena ended the call, a rush of adrenaline filled her chest. Not fear, momentum. Her hands shook slightly, but it wasn't nerves. It was energy. This wasn't about Nathan. It wasn't about loss. It was about recovering the parts of herself she had handed away without hesitation. That evening, while Nathan browsed through his digital calendar, he noticed a blank slot later that week, a rare evening without obligations. Camilla, passing behind him, peeked at the screen and said, "We should host something. Maybe a dinner. Show them who we are now. The new us?" Nathan echoed. She smiled, brushing her hand along his shoulder. "Isn't that what this is?" He nodded, slowly. But something about those words didn't sit quite right. He poured himself another drink and wandered over to the window, looking out over the city night. Somewhere out there, Helena was rebuilding everything, without luxury, without backing, without influence. And for reasons he couldn't quite define, it unsettled him. That thought disturbed him more than anything Camilla had said that night. The early spring breeze carried the faintest promise of renewal. But for Nathan Calloway, everything felt unchanged. Each day still began with the scent of designer cologne, the crisp gleam of his cufflinks, and the soft whir of the espresso machine reverberating through the penthouse. He scanned market reports on his tablet, while Camilla, always polished and composed, moved effortlessly through the kitchen, reminding him about schedules and commitments. On the surface, their lives were a picture-perfect display of modern ambition. Two driven minds in sync, poised, unstoppable. But beneath the pristine exterior, tiny fissures were spreading, and neither seemed aware of how far they reached. In the public eye, they were golden. Together, they adorned business magazine covers, co-hosted black-tie events, and breezed through industry functions with charm and precision. Camilla had fully stepped into the spotlight Helena once quietly supported, always at Nathan's side, taking notes, mingling with VIPs, presenting a seamless image of continuity. But unlike Helena, Camilla had no interest in standing beside power. She wanted to wield it, shape it, drive it, bend it to her own design. Nathan respected that at first. It felt dynamic, alive. But slowly, her ambition began to cast a shadow across his confidence. For every bold move she made, Nathan felt a flicker of uncertainty tighten in his chest, like a warning he couldn't quite decipher. His certainty, once unshakable, now thinned at the edges. That fire began to singe the edges of their partnership, and he wasn't sure yet whether it would temper them or burn the whole thing down. Behind closed doors, Camilla had grown more commanding, nudging into authority, challenging his decisions in ways that sounded collaborative but struck deep. She began meeting clients solo, shifting timelines, making branding calls on her own, all wrapped in efficiency's disguise. Nathan raised his concerns gently at first. "You could have just checked with me, or let's align before the next update." Camilla would lean in, kiss his cheek, and respond sweetly, "I'm just lightening your load, Nate. You've got enough going on." At first, it soothed him, but over time, doubt crept in. Quiet, persistent, it whispered in the silences between their words, in the looks she no longer gave him, in the subtle dismissals that felt too practiced. Meanwhile, across the city, Helena was preparing her own kind of battlefield. The studio had undergone a subtle but powerful transformation. What was once an empty concrete space now glowed with soft lighting, curated decor, tidy desks with fresh flowers, and an open layout primed for learning and connection. It wasn't about prestige, it was about intention. A calm, functional space designed not to dazzle, but to uplift. Helena hadn't planned to dive in this fast, but once momentum caught on, it became impossible to slow down. Simone had introduced her to a handful of trusted contacts, local creatives, founders, coaches. Soon Helena was facilitating strategic workshops for mid-career women, advising budding entrepreneurs, mentoring early-stage professionals. She was becoming someone people turned to, not for her past, but for what she brought to the present. In those circles, Helena wasn't known as Nathan Calloway's former spouse. She was a thought leader, a resource, someone who knew how to navigate quiet wars and win them without a sound. And she did it without the noise, without the need for recognition. Her strength came not from retaliation, but from reclamation. But Helena wasn't building from bitterness. She was building to reconnect with herself. Still, she wasn't naive. She sensed Nathan's attention. He hadn't reached out, but there were signs. Old acquaintances making oddly specific inquiries. Former colleagues of his showing up at her gatherings, feigning coincidence. She managed it all gracefully, never startled, never reactive. She didn't want conflict, but she was ready for it now. One afternoon, as she reviewed her calendar at her desk, her phone lit up with a call she hadn't expected. Jonathan Marks, a well-known investor and once a central figure in one of Nathan's landmark deals. They had met briefly years ago at a charity function, and Helena barely remembered the interaction. Yet here he was now, asking if she'd be open to a meeting. He said he'd been following her recent work, and that her vision intrigued him. She hesitated, but agreed to meet the following day. When she arrived at the quiet, upscale restaurant, she was surprised to find Jonathan already seated, reviewing a document. He stood as she approached, offering a warm, respectful handshake. "Helena," he greeted with a smile. "Thanks for making the time on such short notice." "That's unexpected," she replied with a composed smile. "But I'll take it as a compliment." Jonathan chuckled. "It is. What you're doing, it's smart, grounded, and honestly, it aligns with the direction I think the market is moving more than most of the overhyped strategies I've seen in boardrooms." She tilted her head slightly. "I didn't realize you were watching grassroots models." "I wasn't," he said, "until yours started drawing attention. And not just locally. People are talking not just about the programs, but about you." Helena stayed quiet, still unsure of his endgame. "I've always known you were more than just the woman behind Nathan Calloway," he continued. "But not everyone saw it. Now they do, and that matters." "What are you proposing?" she asked. Jonathan leaned in. "A partnership. I've been looking to expand into community-focused development and education-driven enterprises. What you've built is more promising than anything else I've come across in months." Helena leaned back, digesting his words. It wasn't just flattery, it was an opening, one she hadn't anticipated. "Let me think about it," she said after a pause. "Of course," Jonathan replied, but something in his eyes told her he knew she wouldn't say no, not in the long run. That evening, back at home, Helena sat at her kitchen table, notebook open, thoughts cascading. She began sketching out ideas. Her hand moved quickly. She wasn't reacting anymore. She was strategizing. Meanwhile, in the penthouse, Nathan paced in his office. A lingering tension had filled the space all week. That morning's financial report showed an unexpected decline across several key revenue channels. He'd spent hours digging into it. Clients were less responsive, deliverables were behind schedule. Nothing fatal. Yet, but enough to rattle him. He didn't know if it was sabotage or just operational cracks. Either option left him uneasy. Camilla walked into the room, phone in hand, her expression tight. "You're not hearing me anymore," she said abruptly. He turned sharply. "What are you talking about?" "You're paranoid," she snapped. "You've second-guessed every decision I've made this week. You don't trust me. I'm watching deals fall apart, deals that should have been locked down months ago." "Or maybe," she replied, stepping closer, "those cracks were already there. You just didn't see them because it was easier to blame someone else." Her voice had lost all pretense of diplomacy. "Are you saying this is my fault?" he asked. "I'm saying," she answered, eyes steady, "not everything unraveling is about me." Nathan stared at her, searching for a reply that didn't come. Camilla turned and left the room before he could respond. That night, as Nathan stood by the window with a drink in hand, he caught his reflection. But this time, it looked unfamiliar. Not a mogul. Not a man in control. A man who had won battles and now had no idea how to live without the war. Across the city, Helena was reviewing a proposal from Jonathan Marks. A gentle smile played at the corners of her lips as the evening breeze rustled through the open window. She closed her notebook, leaned back in her chair, and felt something she hadn't in years. She wasn't just rebuilding anymore, she was ascending. The evening air was thick with warmth, the kind that wrapped around you like velvet, dense and deliberate. The Calloway penthouse, as always, was dressed to dazzle. Crystal vases brimming with white orchids, champagne flutes gleaming on marble counters, and ambient light spilling from recessed ceilings. Outside, the city glittered beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, an electric backdrop to yet another curated gathering. Tonight was a private pre-gala reception, a who's who of finance, media, and politics, the kind of affair where whispers sealed partnerships and toasts sealed deals. Nathan stood at the center of it all, every inch composed in a midnight blue tuxedo. His cufflinks caught the light as he greeted guests with polished charm. He moved through the space like a seasoned maestro, schmoozing investors, clasping hands with executives, pausing briefly for carefully framed photos before politely nudging photographers out the door. At his side, Camilla played her role with near-clinical perfection. Her floor-length silk gown clung like a second skin, every element of her look carefully curated to communicate status, elegance, and allure. Her laughter hit precisely on cue, her gaze radiating the kind of warm familiarity that invited trust and whispered secrets. She stood just behind Nathan, near enough to signify influence, far enough to imply deference. She was impeccable, and yet, beneath the shimmer and polish of the evening, something faint and unresolved hummed between them. A friction too subtle for casual observers, but impossible to miss for anyone watching closely. There was a tension in Nathan's jaw when no one watched, a stiffness in Camilla's smile when he interrupted her mid-conversation. Nathan felt it in the quiet seconds between pleasantries, the ghost of a question he hadn't dared name. Was this success or just performance? He remembered when nights like these used to thrill him, but now they echoed. He couldn't tell if the chill came from the air or from somewhere inside him. Their once charged dynamic had cooled into something more tactical than passionate. Their glances held no longing, only calculus. They weren't tethered by emotion anymore. They were aligned by optics, ambition, and leverage. As the room buzzed with clinking glasses and whispered deals, across the city, Helena stepped into a quiet bookstore tucked between a laundromat and a flower shop. The wooden floor groaned underfoot, and the air smelled of paper and time. She'd promised herself she'd take Mason there after dinner, a rare night when he seemed genuinely excited to talk about something from his lit class. They wandered the aisles together, Mason pointing out books he needed, while Helena ran her fingers over titles she hadn't thought of in years. There was something honest about the space, something grounding. It reminded her of who she was before timelines and trade-offs, before partnership meant vanishing in plain sight. As she reached for a book on a high shelf, her phone vibrated. A message from Simone: "We've locked the date, next Friday. Moving fast. You ready?" Helena stared at the message for a long second before replying, "Yes, let's do it." That single word, ready, held more gravity than anything she'd written in months. Once, she would have hesitated, rethought it, looked for escape routes. But now she wasn't asking for permission, she was claiming space. And she wasn't afraid of how much she wanted it, not anymore. Back at the penthouse, a guest leaned in and murmured something into Camilla's ear. Just a few words, but enough to freeze her for a fraction of a second. Nathan noticed. The shift was minor, but unmistakable. When the guest moved along, he stepped in. "What was that about?" he asked under his breath. Camilla's lips pressed together. "Nothing important." "Camilla," he said, voice low and firm, "don't handle me like a stakeholder. What did he say?" She hesitated, then sighed. "He said Helena's hosting a launch event next week. Apparently it's getting some traction in certain circles." Nathan blinked. "What kind of event?" "Not sure. Some kind of consultancy or mentoring program." He didn't have details, just that her name's coming up again. Nathan let out a soft laugh, but there was no humor in it, only disbelief. "She's throwing networking events now. She's building something. Nate, people are starting to take notice." Camilla's voice was steady, but her eyes flickered. Nathan's face darkened. "People notice anything new for 5 minutes. That doesn't make it meaningful." "Maybe," Camilla said, turning to refill her wine. But the words lingered in his mind. Later that night, after the guests had trickled out and staff began clearing the remnants of the evening, Nathan sat alone on the terrace, drink in hand, overlooking the glowing sprawl of the city. The music had faded, but his thoughts played on a loop. He hadn't considered Helena's ambitions in years. He assumed there weren't any left. That had always been the difference between them. He charged forward. She maintained. He chased change. She held the line. Or so he thought. On impulse, he picked up his phone and did something he hadn't done in ages. He searched her name. Dozens of results filled the screen. Local media features, interviews in niche industry journals, blog posts from attendees applauding her workshops. A video clip from a recent speaking engagement at a business development forum sat at the top of the page. He hit play. There she was, standing confidently, speaking about reinvention, resilience, and the value of seasoned experience. No bitterness, no mention of him or their past, no gimmicks, just truth, clarity, and presence, and people were listening. He watched the video in full, then leaned back, eyes fixed on the skyline. He couldn't say what disturbed him more, that Helena had found her voice, or that he'd never once truly listened to it when she was beside him. The next morning, Camilla noticed the change. He was distant, distracted. When she brought up an upcoming gala appearance, he waved her off. "Handle it," he muttered, eyes locked on his tablet. She paused, watched him a moment, then turned and left. Across the city, Helena stood in the center of her studio, observing as her team prepared for the big day. Chairs were being set, equipment tested, welcome materials handed out. The space buzzed with momentum. For the first time in years, Helena didn't feel like she was on the sidelines of something larger. She was at the core. Not a guest, not an accessory. She was the host, the builder, the name on the banner. She approached a corner where Mason was helping set up a projector. He turned with a rare, proud smile. "This looks incredible, Mom." "Thanks," she said, hand on his shoulder. "It's just the beginning." Outside, guests began arriving. Familiar faces, new ones, curious ones. At the entrance, Helena welcomed them warmly. She noticed one woman, early 30s, hovering near the doorway, notebook clutched tightly, nervous. Helena approached with a gentle smile. "First time?" The woman nodded. "I almost didn't come. I didn't think I'd fit in." Helena's voice softened. "You already do. Come in." Just like that, another story had begun. Back at the Callaway penthouse, Camilla's heels clicked sharply against the polished floors as she moved through the space, phone to ear, giving brisk instructions to a caterer about an upcoming dinner. Nathan sat on the living room couch, his eyes on a muted news broadcast, but his mind was far away, replaying thoughts, forming questions he wasn't ready to ask. He had grown quieter in recent days, less engaged. His inbox went unanswered longer. He skimmed numbers he once scrutinized. He passed meetings to others. Camilla had noticed. At first she said nothing. She preferred silence to misreading. But now, the change concerned her. That night she found him in the bedroom, staring at the ceiling, tablet glowing dimly on his chest. "You're not sleeping," she said plainly. He turned his head slightly. "I'm just thinking." "You've been just thinking for 2 weeks." He didn't answer right away. He sat up slowly, rubbing his face. "I've been reading about Helena." Camilla stiffened. "Why?" "Because I want to understand what she's doing. Why it's working. How she's connecting with people I never thought would care." Camilla sat on the edge of the bed, her expression unreadable. "Maybe it's nothing. A few glowing write-ups, some buzz at the right moment. Sure, that happens. People love a redemption arc," Nathan said, his voice low, more thoughtful than critical. "But this doesn't feel like a phase. This feels intentional." Camilla didn't respond. She moved toward her vanity, removing her earrings with slow precision. "Are you regretting something, Nate?" He met her gaze in the mirror. "No, I'm observing." But Camilla had been around him long enough to know what that tone meant. It was the same tone he used before pulling out of risky ventures, before quietly dissolving partnerships. It meant he was recalculating, measuring risk versus reward. And that realization irritated her. She'd invested too much, maneuvered too carefully, to have him distracted by shadows of a life he left behind. The next afternoon, Nathan attended the annual Chamber of Commerce luncheon, a fixture on his calendar for a decade. The venue buzzed with familiar names and polished smiles. Executives, philanthropists, influencers. But for the first time, he didn't feel like the room revolved around him. Conversations happened without him. Laughter echoed from across the hall. Even the keynote speaker, a former protege, offered only a cursory nod in his direction. It wasn't hostility. It was displacement. A subtle but deliberate shift. And then he heard it. "Have you heard about Helena Callaway's new partnership? What she's doing with community enterprise funding is impressive, way more sustainable than any of Callaway Group's recent initiatives." He wasn't supposed to hear that, but he did, and the words clung to him. That evening, Camilla found him in his study, surrounded by opened files, spreadsheets, and a half-finished bottle of whiskey. He didn't acknowledge her at first, his focus locked on a faded document pulled from an archived folder. It was one of Helena's old strategic drafts from the early days of his company, one he dismissed as too idealistic. too focused on long-range impact. But now, rereading it, he saw clarity. Foresight. "She was ahead of me in some ways," he murmured without looking up. Camilla raised an eyebrow. "I'm sorry. What?" "Helena," he said. "She was thinking about things I never paid attention to." Camilla folded her arms, her irritation simmering just beneath the surface. "And what exactly are you trying to say?" "I'm not saying anything," he said evenly. "I'm just realizing some things." She turned without replying and walked out, closing the bedroom door a little too loudly. Across town, Helena sat in her studio, refining plans for the next stage of her mentorship series. The launch had gone better than expected. Attendees had reached out with collaboration requests. 2 local backers had offered seed funding. One young founder even sent Helena a handwritten note, thanking her for creating a space where someone like her could feel seen. The letter moved Helena, not out of grief, but reflection. In that young woman's uncertainty, she saw her younger self. The version who once stood beside Nathan with ideas in hand, only to be told to focus on appearances and logistics. Most evenings, Mason was nearby on the couch, earbuds in, focused on homework. They rarely spoke during those quiet stretches, but the silence was companionable. Steady. While sorting through old storage boxes one night, Helena stumbled across a photo she hadn't seen in years. Her and Nathan at one of their early company retreats. His arm was around her, both of them laughing, unguarded, hopeful. She stared at it, not with nostalgia, but distance. That version of them didn't exist anymore. And she didn't need it to. She placed it back in the box, then paused, pulling out a different envelope, an unopened letter she had written near the end of their marriage. It wasn't sentimental, it was meticulous. A breakdown of financial decisions made over the years, things she had questioned, things he had ignored. But now, rereading the figures and annotations, Helena saw something she hadn't before. Certain assets, property deeds, inactive accounts, licensing contracts, had shifted without proper documentation. If traced correctly, some of those transfers could unlock an avenue she hadn't even considered. She took a slow breath, closed the envelope, and set it aside. Not as a weapon, not as revenge, but as a lever, carefully positioned, precise, and patient. She understood now that power didn't need to shout. Sometimes it just needed to wait in silence. Back at the Callaway penthouse, Camilla felt a growing unease. Nathan's silence had deepened. She noticed how he reviewed everything more cautiously, how old project files reappeared on his desk, documents she assumed were long buried. He wasn't unraveling loudly. He was recalibrating, quietly, methodically. And worst of all, he had started locking his office when she wasn't around. Camilla's control faltered in those locked-door silences. She realized that the man she thought she knew, the man who once shared everything, was retreating into shadows she couldn't reach. One afternoon while he was out, Camilla slipped inside his office and flipped through the drawers. Most of it was expected. Memos, financials, correspondence. But then she found a folder marked Callaway Provisional Holdings. Inside were pages she'd never seen, Shell Corporation documents, offshore transfers, discrete equity holdings. Not illegal, but hardly clean. It made her wonder, how much had Helena known? How much had she signed? And what had she quietly recorded? The board was in motion. But Camilla couldn't tell who was making the better moves. And neither could Nathan. It was just after sunrise when the first shipment of gold-edged wedding invitations arrived at the penthouse. Camilla stood in the foyer, watching staff carry in boxes of silk-tied envelopes. The scent of paper and glue clung to the air as she opened one, fingertips brushing the raised lettering. Crafted in Paris, exactly to her specifications. Nathan had approved the designs weeks earlier, mostly out of obligation. And now the countdown had officially begun. 32 days until their wedding. In public, the engagement was already a spectacle. Society pages declared it the most talked-about union of the year, a marriage of elegance and influence. Camilla's face had graced bridal spreads, crowned the face of modern luxe. Nathan, always more restrained, had given one approved interview where he called his fiancée brilliant, graceful, and everything I didn't know I needed. His publicist wrote the line. Camilla had memorized it. Privately, wedding preparations were more ordeal than romance. Her mood had sharpened with each passing day. She barked at assistants for minor oversights, fired 2 vendors in a week, and revised the guest list so often the planner stopped printing copies. She began correcting the floral designer on color palettes no one else noticed, and sent the pastry team back to the drawing board 3 times because the cake lacked presence. In those moments, the sheen of perfection turned brittle. Each correction, each rebuke exposed a fear beneath the glamour, a fear that this narrative of power might unravel before the final curtain. It had to be flawless, not for Nathan, not even for herself, but for the narrative. This wasn't just a wedding, it was a statement, her arrival. Nathan, for his part, had become increasingly detached. He let Camilla run the details, offered nods during briefings, signed off on expenses without reading the fine print. But his mind drifted. Too often it drifted to Helena. What she was doing, how her name now resurfaced in conversations where he once held unchallenged influence. It was no longer just curiosity, it was recognition. The kind that settles in your gut when you're forced to admit someone else's glow is brighter than your own. At first he brushed it off, then he noticed it again, and again, until it no longer felt like coincidence. It felt like presence. Constant, quiet, powerful. What he didn't know was that Helena had already received an invitation. The day the engagement was announced in the press, a ripple moved through the networks. Helena now walked with calm confidence. Her new collaborators, partners, and clients all noticed it. Some mentioned it in passing, others hinted more directly, but Helena said nothing. She only smiled and continued with her day. The studio thrived. The mentorship series grew. A podcast producer reached out for a feature. A publishing agent expressed interest in a book. She moved forward, not from resentment, but from a renewed sense of direction. Still, somewhere in the corners of her thoughts, there was a twist at the image of Camilla in a white dress beside Nathan. Not because she wanted him back, she didn't, but because it brought back how she had once been framed, polished, placed, and presented as an ornament to his world. And she wondered, did Camilla understand what it meant to become that woman? It was Marin who first proposed it. "Send him something," she said one morning over coffee. "Not out of pettiness, out of strategy. This is chess now, Helena. Own that." Helena had laughed. "And what would I even send him?" Marin leaned in, eyes sharp with suggestion. "Send him a memory." Helena thought about it for days. She didn't want spectacle. She didn't want reaction. But a memory, yes, that was different. That was layered. A message only Nathan would decode. Something private. A quiet reminder of who she was and what she remembered. The following week, while Camilla obsessed over floral arrangements and velvet table runners, Helena sat at her kitchen table and wrote. At first the words came slow, then steady. There was no mention of love, no nostalgia. It was business, precision, integrity. She referred to events only Nathan would recall, dates, decisions, moments he believed she'd forgotten. She didn't blame, she alluded, she didn't threaten, she reflected. And at the end, she wrote a line that would sound harmless to anyone else, but would hit him with unmistakable force. "I've been revisiting old files out of curiosity. Amazing what you miss when trust is assumed." She printed it, folded it with care, and sealed it in an envelope with no signature, no return address, just his name written by hand. The letter was delivered by courier to the rehearsal dinner venue, addressed specifically to Nathan Calloway, with instructions to deliver it directly to the groom's suite. It arrived late Friday, just as the ballroom lights were being tested and the string quartet was rehearsing. A staff member placed the envelope on a table near the seating chart and champagne bottles. It sat there untouched for hours. When Nathan eventually noticed it, he assumed it was vendor paperwork. He opened it casually. At first, he skimmed, then he read, then he froze. The second read brought recognition. The third brought discomfort. By the fourth, his fingers were trembling slightly. He didn't speak. Camilla was in the next room, bickering with the stylist about cufflink colors. Nathan sat alone, eyes on the letter, trying to assess what it meant. What it threatened without threatening. There was no anger in it, no desperation, just precision. And it pierced deeper than anything louder could have. Helena hadn't written as someone holding on to the past. She had written like someone who never left the game. When Camilla stepped into the room and saw his face, she asked, "What's wrong?" Nathan quickly folded the letter and slid it into his jacket. "Nothing," he replied. "Just something I need to revisit." But his voice gave it away. That night, on stage during the rehearsal, thanking guests and posing for photos, Nathan wasn't hearing anything. Not the laughter, not the music. His mind was elsewhere. His thoughts kept returning to Helena's letter, to her words, to the way she had timed it with surgical precision. Just days before his wedding, at the apex of what should have been his most victorious chapter, Nathan glanced across the ballroom at Camilla, striking in her couture dress, laughing effortlessly among a circle of stylists and planners, and for the first time he questioned how much she truly knew. About him, his business, his past. That night, he didn't sleep. Long after Camilla had drifted off, he rose from bed and stood at the floor-to-ceiling window. The city lights sparkled below, unmoved, but something in him had shifted. Quietly, permanently. He didn't know how to name it yet, only that it was real. Across town, Helena sat alone in her studio, sipping from a mug of tea as she reviewed the final draft of her keynote address. The room was still, the lighting soft. She didn't know how Nathan would react to the letter. She didn't need to. Her purpose had already been served. The wedding day approached like a precision-tuned clock, every hour accounted for, every minute scheduled. The venue gleamed with white roses cascading from archways, satin draping polished floors, and gold accents catching light from custom chandeliers. Everything was arranged to reflect not intimacy, but stature. A showcase of power masked as a union. And underneath it all, a quiet unease hummed through Nathan's chest. No one else heard it. But he did. A dull, persistent awareness that wouldn't let go. He moved through the wedding preparations on autopilot, shaking hands, confirming arrangements, thanking staff. Camilla, meanwhile, handled the spotlight with practiced poise. She gave direction between photo ops, smiled through last-minute changes, and floated between conversations like a woman already anointed. But this wasn't just a wedding to her. It was a coronation, a symbolic claiming of the life she had so carefully angled herself toward. Nathan, however, couldn't shake the letter. He had reread it more times than he could count. And each time, new layers revealed themselves. Calm, professional observations that somehow felt like chess moves. She had written about past transactions, specific, strategic, and made it clear she hadn't forgotten. He remembered those choices, moving funds, rerouting shares, authorizing shell entities. He had always assumed Helena wasn't truly paying attention. Now, he wasn't sure. Her calm tone, her precise language, it all suggested otherwise. That realization gnawed at him. Over the next few days, while Camilla obsessed over guest lists and fittings, Nathan locked himself in his home office. He pulled old tax files, reviewed ownership blogs, and reread merger documents that hadn't crossed his mind in years. And slowly, patterns emerged. Asset shifts, accounts quietly reassigned. Dormant holdings attached to companies that had existed for name only. Helena had signed off on many, but she had also requested copies. He remembered now how she always asked for duplicates, filed things in color-coded binders, took notes even when no one asked her to. He had assumed it was habit. What if it was preparation? Late one night, drink in hand, he stood again at the window. The skyline hadn't changed, but his view of the past had. He had believed himself untouchable, that Helena had been too soft, too passive to ever challenge him. But maybe that had always been the lie, confusing restraint with surrender. Meanwhile, across town, Helena sat at her desk, binder open, reviewing each tabbed section with fresh eyes. Years of financial records lay before her. Every signature, every clause, every document she had been told to sign, but quietly studied. She hadn't planned to make any of it public. She wasn't trying to destroy Nathan. But if he ever tried to erase her, from shared ventures, from assets she'd supported, from history, she would be ready. Not with rage, with evidence. Cold, clean facts. Her fingertips grazed an old photo nestled between the pages of a binder, a picture of her younger self standing beside Nathan Calloway during a groundbreaking ceremony. She looked different then. Softer. Maybe more hopeful. She held the photo for a moment before setting it down. That version of her was gone. In her place stood someone tempered by compromise, silence, and now, clarity. Savannah arrived shortly after, a folder tucked under her arm. "I went through the rest of the files," she said, dropping it on the table. "You were right. A few of those asset transfers look questionable." "Can we prove it?" Helena asked. "Not in court, not yet. But enough to make him nervous. And in his world, doubt is poison." Helena nodded slowly. I don't want to ruin him. I just want him to know I'm not invisible anymore." Savannah smiled knowingly. He knows. The real question is, what's he going to do about it? Meanwhile, Camilla could feel the shift in Nathan's mood. He wasn't interested in the final suit fittings or the honeymoon itinerary. He offered vague nods to her questions, stared past her when she spoke, and vanished into his office for hours without reason. When she confronted him, he waved it off. "I'm handling last-minute logistics," he muttered. "Since when do you care about seating charts and napkin colors?" She pressed. He turned to her then, his gaze tired. "There are things you wouldn't understand, Camilla." "Then help me understand," she challenged. But he didn't. Instead, he withdrew further, and for all her composure and control, Camilla began to feel something unfamiliar: anxiety. Then came the rehearsal dinner. The venue was grand, filled with elegant laughter, crystal glassware, and perfectly curated speeches. Nathan stood at the head of the table, raising a glass. His words were eloquent, but hollow. Camilla stood beside him, all poise and polish, her smile flawless as she scanned the room, alert for even the smallest imperfection. Just as dessert arrived, a server approached Nathan discreetly and handed him a small box, wrapped in elegant paper, no sender listed. Just his name, handwritten in a familiar script. He opened it slowly. Inside was a gold bracelet, simple, classic. The same bracelet he had given Helena on their 10th anniversary. The same one she had worn with quiet devotion for years. He recognized it instantly. But what truly froze him was the note tucked beneath. "Some things you try to replace. Others return to remind you they were never truly gone." He stared at it for a long time, his fingers wrapping around the metal. Camilla noticed his expression shift. "What is it?" she asked, but he didn't respond. Because in that moment, something long buried clicked into place. The past wasn't just echoing anymore. It was speaking. The sun had barely crested the skyline when Nathan Calloway stepped into the quiet penthouse suite reserved for him at the wedding venue. The windows framed the city like a photograph. The space was immaculate, flawlessly arranged, untouched in its elegance. Camilla's perfection was everywhere. His silver cufflinks laid out with surgical precision. The tailored tuxedo hung crisply beside the wardrobe. Even the cologne bottle was positioned with exact symmetry. But nothing about the morning felt perfect. His chest was weighted with unease. He hadn't slept. He'd spent the night tangled in luxury sheets, haunted not by dreams, but by silence, the kind that presses into your skull and lingers in every corner. He crossed the room to the desk, intending to review his ceremony notes. Camilla had insisted they write their own vows. But he froze when he noticed another envelope, this one placed deliberately at the edge of the table. It hadn't been there the night before. This envelope was unlike the rest he'd received. No golden border, no monogrammed initials, just plain ivory paper sealed with a simple wax stamp. There was no name written on it, but he didn't need one. He already knew who sent it. His fingers trembled slightly as he broke the seal and unfolded the letter. The paper was heavy, textured, deliberately chosen. The handwriting was unmistakable. Helena's. Elegant, deliberate, intimately familiar. He took a breath and began to read. It didn't open with anger. No accusations, no bitterness, no plea for reconciliation. It began with reflection. She wrote about time, how it bends and folds when you least expect it. She spoke of trust, how it can disappear without notice. Of silence, how it sometimes says more than words ever could. And then, without preamble, she began listing the details: dates, accounts, company names, financial transfers, shell corporations. Nathan blinked as he read. Some of the transactions he vaguely recalled, others had been long forgotten. But the precision, the way she had stitched everything together with methodical clarity, was what shook him. Helena had taken what once seemed like scattered memories and turned them into a map. A quiet, pointed threat dressed in neutrality. She didn't accuse him of wrongdoing. She didn't need to. The outline she presented was irrefutable. Inconsistencies flagged, documentation she had quietly preserved, deals he had brushed off that now seemed damning in context. Near the end, her tone shifted. "I never wanted a fight, Nathan," she wrote, "but I won't disappear quietly. You taught me that leverage builds empires. I have mine now. I won't use it unless I'm forced to. Consider this letter a courtesy, a reminder that not all women burn bridges. Some build new ones you never saw coming." His hands were sweating, his mouth felt dry. He read the letter again, slower, searching for mistakes. But there were none. Helena had always been careful. Now he understood just how deeply he'd underestimated her. He folded the letter and tucked it back into the envelope. Dropping into a nearby chair, he stared out at the skyline. The city was waking up, but inside, everything was unraveling. Could she really access those records? Were her signatures still active on those old companies? Had he left himself that exposed? He remembered then how she once insisted her name stay on several filings just in case. He hadn't cared then. She'd asked quietly, and he had been too busy chasing bigger wins. Now those harmless decisions might be his undoing. A knock interrupted his thoughts. "Nate?" Camilla's voice floated through the door. "Everything okay?" He rubbed his eyes, forced his voice steady. "Yeah, I'll be down in a minute. They're waiting for photos. I said I'll be there." Silence. Then her footsteps retreated down the hallway. He walked to the mirror, studying the man staring back at him. The tux was flawless. The cufflinks gleamed. But none of it mattered. The man reflected. There wasn't the confident CEO he thought he was. He was standing on the edge now, and the ground beneath him no longer felt solid. He placed the letter inside his jacket pocket. He didn't know why he was bringing it. He just knew he couldn't leave it behind. The ceremony unfolded in a blur. Camilla was radiant as she walked down the aisle, every gesture refined, every step perfect. The guests stood. The music swelled. Nathan smiled on cue, cameras clicked, but his mind was elsewhere, still with the letter, still with Helena, still unraveling. He stumbled slightly over his vows. No one caught it but Camilla. Her glance was sharp, a silent warning. "Don't mess this up." He regained composure, forced a smile, recited his lines. But the letter pressed against his chest like a stone. Later, as guests sipped champagne and laughter filled the room, Nathan excused himself, claiming a phone call. He stepped into a private lounge, locked the door, and drew out the letter again. He read it one final time. Slowly. Letting every line settle deep, there was no denying it now. Helena had power now. Real power. And Nathan had given it to her unknowingly over years of arrogance and assumption. He had thought he was trading up when he replaced her. But the truth was, he had never really seen her. Not for who she was. He had underestimated her mind, her foresight, her ability to wield complexity, not with noise, but with silence. Now she held his empire in her hands, not through court orders or headlines, but through the kind of quiet leverage that could unravel everything. If she chose. He sat there for a long time, the letter resting in his lap, the sounds of laughter and celebration echoing faintly through the walls. He knew he couldn't go back out and pretend. Something had shifted, something fundamental. A truth had emerged, not just about Helena, but about himself. And he wasn't sure which one frightened him more. The morning after the wedding began in silence. Not the comfortable kind born of intimacy, but the kind that made every movement, every sip of coffee, every creak of a chair, feel unnaturally loud. Nathan sat alone at the breakfast table in the honeymoon suite, staring at untouched food. Camilla had left early for a press interview about the ceremony, smiling, radiant, full of talking points. He hadn't joined her. He hadn't said much at all since the night before. Helena's letter still weighed heavy in his pocket, though he'd read it more times than he could count. It wasn't just the words, it was what they meant. The realization that everything he'd believed to be solid was already shifting beneath him. His phone buzzed. A new alert from his private banking advisor. Unusual activity detected. He opened it absently, but as he read, his chest tightened. Several accounts were being flagged for audit, inconsistencies in account ownership, triggered not by the bank itself, but by an internal oversight system buried in the back end, designed to detect irregular movements within dormant entities. Entities tied to his name. Entities Helena had once co-signed. At first he thought it had to be a mistake. He grabbed his laptop and logged into his secure portal. Red flags blinked on the screen. Restricted access, pending investigation notices. Then came the calls. His lawyer. His investment consultant. Both alerting him to problems with records, old licensing agreements, now under dispute. Documents resurfaced, agreements from years ago. And there they were, her initials. Clear, binding, legitimate. His head spun. This wasn't a media scandal, not yet, but it was no longer quiet, and it wouldn't stay that way. Camilla returned just as he closed his laptop. She was buzzing with press clippings, engagement metrics, compliments. She didn't notice his expression until she sat down with her coffee. "What's wrong?" she asked. He didn't answer at first. He just stared at her as though seeing her with new eyes. "Alex," she pressed, sharper now. "What happened?" He slid the laptop across the table. She looked, then back at him. "An audit?" she asked. He nodded. "Triggered by old transfers. The kind I thought no one would ever question. The kind I never imagined she'd remember." "Helena," she whispered. He nodded again. "I thought you said it was nothing, that she was just posturing." "I was wrong." Camilla stood and began to pace. "Okay, we'll call the legal team. We'll lock it down, freeze exposure." "It's not just about freezing anything," Nathan replied, quieter now. "She's not going public. She's not trying to embarrass me. She's showing me the places I left unguarded. She's dismantling this from the inside." Camilla turned to him, her tone fraying. "How does this even happen? You've had control over everything." He met her eyes. "I never had full control. I only thought I did." The silence between them was heavier than anything else in the room. Camilla poured another coffee, her hands unsteady. For the first time since they'd met, she didn't know where she stood. Everything she'd built with Nathan had been based on the myth of his dominance. If that cracked, what did she have left? That afternoon, Nathan started making calls. He tried to patch what he could, reaching out to partners, revisiting old deals, pulling favors he hadn't used in years. But each call ended the same, with hesitation, with polite concern, with distance. The people who once feared him no longer did. And in his world, power was only respected when it was absolute. That evening brought another blow, an anonymous tip submitted to the Financial Integrity Bureau. It flagged potential conflicts of interest in one of his international ventures. The tip hadn't come from Helena. She hadn't moved directly, but the timing wasn't coincidence. She had stirred the waters. Others were beginning to notice. The sharks were circling. Camilla snapped that night. She had just ended a tense call with her PR agent when she stormed into Nathan's study, tossing her phone onto the desk. "This is spiraling, Nathan. People are already asking questions. Investors are nervous. We need to issue a statement." "No," he said, voice steady. "You're just going to sit here and let this explode?" I said no. Her eyes narrowed. "You're going to let her dismantle everything, and you're not going to fight back?" He stood slowly. "She's not dismantling anything. She's showing me where the cracks already were." "You're being sentimental," Camilla snapped. "That's exactly how she's winning." "No," Nathan replied, quieter now. "She's winning because I thought she never could." The words landed like a blow. Camilla froze, stunned, hearing something she hadn't expected. She realized then that the foundation of their relationship was shifting. For the first time, she saw clearly that whatever loyalty Nathan had offered, it had never truly belonged to her. It had always been conditional, situational. And now, as his world began to fracture, he wasn't reaching for her. He was looking back into a past he had discarded, only to realize that what he thought was buried had merely been dormant. That night, as Camilla packed a suitcase in silence, Nathan sat by the window, Helena's letter in his hand. He read it again slowly, then placed it carefully on the table. He opened his phone and scrolled until he found her name, Helena Calloway. His thumb hovered over the call button. He didn't press it, because whatever he needed to say, whatever apology he might offer, wouldn't change what had already begun. The collapse was already in motion. The suite was still in quiet disarray when morning light spilled across the hardwood floors. Camilla's half-packed suitcase sat near the door, its flaps open, clothes spilling out like unfinished sentences. Nathan remained motionless in the armchair by the fireplace, his face drawn, his fingers slowly rubbing his temple in circular motion. The silence wasn't new, but today it had a finality to it. He hadn't spoken to Camilla since the night before. She hadn't pushed. Something between them had broken, not with rage but with stillness, with all the words left unsaid now ringing louder than anything else. He thought about Helena constantly, not with longing, but with a strange blend of regret and awe. It struck him that his biggest mistake hadn't been doubting her. It had been believing she was too fragile to matter. She hadn't fought him with fury. She had waited, with foresight, with precision. And now, everything around him, his finances, his partnerships, even his personal relationships, was unraveling. By midday, another alert arrived. One of his most valuable overseas investments had been suspended, pending legal review. He made the calls, to lawyers, to advisors, but their voices were cautious, rehearsed. No one was giving him clear answers. Some of them were already stepping back, quietly, reassigning portfolios, crafting exit plans. One longtime associate, once among his fiercest advocates, sent a vague email postponing a future partnership. Nathan read it twice, then deleted it without replying. His reputation wasn't destroyed, but it was bleeding. And in his world, bleeding was more dangerous than breaking. Scandals could be spun, wounds destroyed from within. Later that day, Nathan tried calling Noah. He hadn't spoken to his son since the wedding. He dialed twice, then stopped, unable to go through with it. He didn't know what to say. Did Helena tell Noah what was happening? Did Noah even care? The space between them now felt insurmountable. Camilla returned that evening. The air between them was stiff. She moved through the suite without a word, answering his questions with clipped replies. She didn't ask about the fallout. She didn't bring up Helena. And Nathan didn't offer anything. She had believed in the illusion of his invincibility. Now that it had shattered, she wasn't sure what was left. She poured herself a drink and finally asked, "What do you want me to do?" Nathan looked up, surprised. "What do you mean? Do you want me to stay?" she said, calm, even. "Because if I'm going to keep standing beside you, I need to know I'm not just standing next to someone who's already halfway out the door." He didn't answer, because he didn't know. She didn't wait. She stood, left her glass on the counter, and walked into the bedroom. The door clicked shut behind her. Not a slam, just an ending. The next morning, when Nathan arrived at his office, there was a sealed envelope waiting on his desk. It had been delivered by hand, no courier, no tracking, just his name written in familiar cursive. His assistant, puzzled, said only that a woman had dropped it off, sunglasses on, scarf wrapped tight, saying it was personal. Nathan opened it slowly. Inside was another letter. This one was shorter. "I don't want what's yours, Nathan. I only want what's mine, what was always mine. You once taught me that control is perception. But what you forgot is that perception can shift, and now so has the power. This is not revenge, this is equilibrium." There was no signature. But he didn't need one. He sat for a long time afterward, watching the traffic blur through the window below. It hit him then, how fragile everything truly was. Not just his business, his legacy. He had always measured success in market shares, assets, accolades. But none of it could protect him from truth, or from the quiet strength of someone he had dismissed for too long. Without thinking, he stood, walked to the far shelf, and pulled out an old photograph, hidden behind binders. Faded, edges curled. It was him and Helena, taken during their first conference. They weren't lovers then. Just partners, equal, aligned. He looked at it for a long while, then turned it face down. That afternoon, he canceled 3 meetings. He sat in his office as the sun dipped behind the skyline, the amber glow casting long shadows on the floor. Just before dusk, he picked up his phone and dialed Helena's number. Not for reconciliation, not for forgiveness. He just needed to hear her voice. The line rang. Then voicemail. He didn't leave a message. He set the phone down and stared at it. Even that, he realized, was hers to withhold now. The scent of rain lingered in the morning air as the sun filtered softly through Helena's studio. Light landed across her desk, files opened, a pen resting between notes, a cup of coffee next to a vase of tulips. Her space, once barren, uncertain, now pulsed with life. Workshops echoed down the hallway. Clients waited in the lounge. Staff moved with confidence. She watched from behind the glass wall, not as a dreamer anymore, but as a foundation. She had become the anchor. Months had passed since the wedding, since the letter, since Nathan Kingsley's empire began its slow unraveling. The press caught wind of it gradually, first in murmurs on niche finance blogs, then as speculation in national columns, lawsuits, resignations, silent withdrawals from board members. The empire hadn't crumbled, but it no longer gleamed untouchably. Camilla was gone, disappeared from public view weeks after the ceremony. No statement, just silence. Some said she had taken a settlement and left for Europe. Others whispered she had walked away. Helena didn't follow it closely. She didn't need to. The important thing wasn't Nathan's fall, it was that he finally had to face truth. That legacy without integrity was paper thin. She didn't rejoice. She felt no glee, only peace. Because peace isn't in victory, it's in clarity. On her desk was a final proposal, a national mentorship program for women in transition, divorcees, widows, professionals returning to work, funded in part by a grant she had secured after months of work. Not because of her name, because of her impact. 3 cities, a digital platform, a book. Helena signed the final page and passed it to her assistant. Later, Noah arrived after class, taller now, more sure of himself. He worked part-time with the studio's tech team. He placed a coffee on her desk. "You look tired," she laughed. "Because I am. But you also look content." "I am that too," he nodded. "Did you think it would turn out like this?" "Not like this," she said, "but I hoped for something close." "You built something real, Mom." "I did," she said, "and this time I built it around what matters, not around someone else." He smiled and stood. "I'll finish setting up the projector. Want me to close up?" "Please," she said, "and double-check the cables." "Always." After he left, Helena leaned back in her chair and looked at a photograph on the shelf, taken during the first event in the space. Back when the walls were still raw and hope felt risky. Now it wasn't hope, it was conviction. That evening, she stepped into the city's rhythm, music from a street corner, laughter from cafes, garlic in the air from the trattoria down the block. It wasn't the life she imagined beside Nathan Kingsley. It was better, because it was hers. At the newsstand, she saw his face on a magazine, The Reckoning of a Titan. She didn't stop. At home, she poured wine, stepped onto her modest balcony, and watched the skyline. The same skyline that once belonged to him. Now it belonged to her. She raised her glass to the horizon, to endings, to beginnings, to power reclaimed, silently, gracefully, permanently. So, that's how the story ends. Or maybe how something new begins. And hey, you're still here, aren't you? Our wonderful, thoughtful friend. If you've made it all the way to this point, then something in this story must have touched your heart. Maybe in a quiet way, like a whisper. Or maybe in a way that shook something loose inside. Either way, you're not alone. Let's take a moment, just you and me, and look at it from another angle. This wasn't just about betrayal or power. It was about rediscovery. About what happens when someone who's been overlooked finds the strength to look inward and stand up, not in anger, but in clarity. Helena's journey reminded us that healing doesn't always come with fireworks. Sometimes it comes in silence, in small choices, in standing firm without shouting. As the Stoics say, you have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. Helena lived that, and maybe in our own ways, so do we. We all carry chapters we thought had ended, pain we packed away, dreams we let gather dust. But healing is not about erasing the past, it's about facing it without fear, about choosing to begin again, even if your voice shakes. So my friend, if this story stirred something in you, let it stay with you. Let it remind you that your silence can carry power and your softness can hold steel. If this resonated with you, take a second, like, share, and subscribe. Not just to follow this journey, but to remind yourself that stories like this matter, because you matter. And until the next story, stay steady, stay brave. And remember, the most powerful kind of revenge is healing.